This is Pink Talks, the place where we discuss intersectionality and human rights.
Hello, welcome to another episode of Pink Talks, a conversation about all things feminism. My name is Margarida Martins.
And I'm Leah Cheney.
And we are your co-hosts for today. So in this Pink Talks, we will be discussing the gendered impacts of armed conflict. Sadly, a very current topic all over the world. And by gendered impacts, we mean the distinct ways, the different ways in which women and men are affected by armed conflict. For example, while men and boys make up the vast majority of direct victims of armed conflict by, for example, recruitment, forced recruitment, and arbitrary detentions, women and girls become more vulnerable to the indirect impacts of war, including gender-based and sexual violence, access to health, food, and education. And these impacts are usually long-lasting.
So today, we will be analyzing the gender-specific harms suffered by women in armed conflict with the help of our two guest speakers, who we would like to introduce, Kirsten, Mika, and Murvi Pasolomi. So thank you both for being here today. Kirsten works at the King's College in London in a hybrid role as a program manager and research associate within the Center for Conflict and Health Research. She encourages the research for health system strengthening in the Northwest Syria program and co-leads the Women Leaders in Health and Conflict initiative, and previously has managed the research for health and conflict in the Middle East and North Africa. Kirsten is also a PhD student at King's College as part of the R4HSS program, in which she is exploring the role of women's leadership in health systems in Northwest Syria. Her research interests currently focus on gender and health system conflict and forced displacement. So, Kirsten, welcome, and thank you for accepting the invitation. Is there anything else you would like to add for your introduction?
Great, thank you. Thank you so much for having me today.
Okay, thank you. And other guest is Murvi Patasami, who works as a gender advisor at the Council of Europe office in Ukraine and is responsible for advising the Council of Europe in cooperation work in the Eastern Partnership countries. Her expertise includes gender mainstreaming and advancing gender equality in multiple contexts, especially in regards to human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. She holds a PhD in gender studies from the University of Helsinki, Finland. It's so nice to have you here, and thank you for accepting our invitation. Is there anything you would quickly like to mention or add or speak a bit more about your work at this point?
No, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I think that was good. Thanks.
Okay, so conflict, especially armed conflict, has many gender-specific effects, like barriers to accessing essential services such as health, education, water, and sanitation, and border challenges such as increased poverty rates and terrorizing employment prospects. These effects lead to increased gender inequality across all sectors of society.
Yes, and in addition, the risk of sexual exploitation and the use of sexual violence as a weapon of war has always been and continues to be present in all conflict zones around the world. And a war on any country, region, or people ends up being also a war on its women. The Ukraine's Commissioner for Human Rights, the Ombudsman Office, for example, has said that she has received over 400 complaints of sexual assault in just 2 weeks, and this number is estimated to be much higher. This kind of offenses tend to be underreported. So I guess the first question for you both would be that, so clearly from what we have said so far, feminist perspective on armed conflict is essential, and in war it's always the most vulnerable who suffer the most, and amongst them women and girls. And while on one hand this sounds obvious, It doesn't have to be, because it's important to recognize that women and girls are not inherently vulnerable. They are simply disadvantaged by unequal gender power relations. So start with an easy one, with an easy question. In your view, how can we transform these power relations so that this will change? What can be done to protect women and girls from the gendered impacts of war? So, Kirsten, I don't know if you want to start.
Yeah, sure. I mean, this is certainly not an easy question. I think there's many layers to it, and I think one thing we really have to think about first of all is that there are a number of different contexts in which conflict happens. As Murvi will also know, reflecting on the Ukrainian conflict, the work that I do is in the Syrian context, which is of course a very different context. We have to think about the history as well of these places. I think one of the key things that I want to mention, though, in regards to transforming those power relations, is how we view women in these settings. And I think sort of redefining their positions and challenging that sort of view of women as only beneficiaries or as victims of conflict as well. And I think, I mean, my focus of research is very much on it from a leadership perspective. And while I don't think that is the only answer, I think that if we start to look at women as real leaders and contributing to, and you know, within that power dynamic, that we can start to sort of change this perception somewhat. I don't know, Murvi, if you wanted to sort of add on to that as well, we can sort of discuss that a bit more.
Yeah, I think that this is something that I've also been thinking about. That of course women and girls are put in vulnerable positions because of a certain kind of power relations. But I do think that it's also important to really try to not only think about protecting but empowering and giving agency to women. So I think that this is really one important aspect. And I also think that in this we can think about, for example, the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace and security, which in many contexts acts as a kind of a framework in regards to when it comes to protecting women, but also about representation and really women taking part in whether it's about deciding about the assistance, humanitarian assistance, or whether it's about peace negotiations or conflict resolutions or so on. So I do think that this is an important aspect, really, that we do not see women and girls not only as the victims, but as those that also have agency and empower them also to be not only the victims but also the protectors. So it's not the dynamic is not only that it's only men that then will be protecting, but also women working towards their own security. So I think that this is an important aspect.
I guess I just wanted to add as well that I think there's that sort of that opportunity within the conflict as well, that as horrible as conflicts are and as violent as they are, then we need to take make something positive from these situations as well. And I think, it's a time in conflict where, power dynamics really are in flux. So I think, sort of capitalizing on that. And I think, if women can play a role in that, that's really important. And I think a lot of support, external support as well. I know definitely from the Syrian context, there is a really large diaspora of women who really support the women inside the country still. And I'm sure that's something that we'll see in the Ukraine as well.
Yes, and I could add to that there is this can be kind of interesting dynamic in conflict in regards to gender roles, that they can be on the one hand, really fixing and kind of cementing certain kind of roles that the men are doing the fighting and the women are doing the reproductive work and the care work and really kind of fixing these traditional roles. But as you said, that it can also be really a kind of a disruptor that then disrupts the gendered roles. And just yesterday, UN Women actually released a rapid gender analysis of the situation in Ukraine, and they had already earlier released the first part of this rapid gender analysis that was desk research, and it shows exactly this kind of a dynamic that on the one hand it can kind of really strengthen certain kind of fixed roles and traditional roles, but on the other hand, it is also acting as something that disrupts. And maybe I should also add that from my perspective, and if I think about my own work, I think that it is really important to also think about gender equality and whether it's about gender relations or gender equality in more general sense, that the more gender equal the society is, also the resilience of society in conflict is stronger, and this is something that is important to think about, that you kind of strengthen it before the conflict or then in post-conflict situations and reconstruction work, because it is then something that can enhance the stability and peace. So I think that's also an important perspective.
Right, of course. I hadn't thought about, it's very interesting that you mentioned that. I hadn't thought about conflict as a disruptor of gender roles, quite the opposite, just as an enforcer of gender roles. But that's very interesting.
And I think that one example, kind of a historical example, is from the Second World War, during which time the women entered the workforce, which then after the war had some effects. So they can, especially kind of a prolonged conflicts can act, but as Kirsten mentioned, of course, this is very context dependent also.
Yeah.
But in certain contexts, it can have this role of disruptor, because the normal structures are broken, and for example, employment and livelihood possibilities now in Ukraine also have dramatically changed, and it could be that it is the for example, women who have a possibility of working instead of men who have been the breadwinners and so on. So these type of things can really act as a disruptor of the traditional roles.
So, healthcare facilities are protected under Geneva Conventions, but in armed conflict around the world, we've seen targeted attacks on hospitals in Syria, Yemen, Afghanistan, and Ukraine, where a maternity hospital was bombed. This, of course, has a devastating impact on humans, but could you explain to us why you decided to focus on conflict and health, Kirsten?
Yeah, sure. I do get asked this question a bit, and it is quite a complicated dynamic. And I think, especially when you start talking about gender within that. But I mean, health and health systems are essential in all settings, stable settings or in conflict settings. And it's really fascinating what happens during a conflict, how these sort of grassroots organizations and individuals come together to continue to provide health, for example. It's, you know, and it's an essential service, even in conflict. I know, for example, education, it can be a lot more difficult to provide education during those times, but whatever happens, you always need doctors and nurses around as well, and that's to support civilians and also military support as well. So I really chose to focus on this because I really wanted to see what those dynamics are in a conflict setting, and thinking about how we can create stronger systems in conflict settings as well, and how they can then feed into post-conflict or the reconstruction phase as well. So I think it's really important to focus on the individuals that are contributing to these systems as well, and how we can look at other systems in conflict settings like education again, other political systems as well, and how they can then rebuild from a bottom-up approach, which I think is something that we see much more after the conflict has disrupted these systems as well. And so it's been even more interesting looking at this from a gender perspective as well. Often we see that in health systems globally, they are, largely led by men but delivered by a woman. And I'm sure we're all very well aware of that. So again, I think this is a really key point, is that we can disrupt this system and then see how we can, make more gender equal systems, and for all individuals as well, not just for women.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned the role of women as performing the care.
Yeah.
And I guess it's a tendency also that we see that perhaps, I'm assuming that when formal care work is not being done because it's been disruptive, probably the large bulk of the informal care work falls on women probably as well.
Yes, definitely.
So there's that perspective as well.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you as well about the role of women as leaders and decision makers, which is in general not given the importance it warrants if it's not straight up undermined. And this is much more aggravated in conflict settings. But however, while armed conflict is a major setback for gender equality, as women are affected in very specific, disproportionate ways by war, perhaps could you tell us, you mentioned this, also you touched upon it a little bit before, but how can conflict settings provide opportunities, if we can call them that, for advancing women's leadership across all sectors, but also in health?
Yeah, sure. So I think sort of building on a little bit what we discussed at the beginning, and I'm sure this will come out a bit more throughout the discussion today. But so I think, conflict settings can really teach us about how we change and challenge power systems and structures, which are often patriarchal. And I find that in speaking with women in conflict settings, that they really collaborate and they can create new spaces through conflict as well as, again, that disruptor. In some of these contexts, like Syria, gender inequality or inequity may not have been a point of discussion or change prior to the conflict occurring. But when it does happen, it sort of brings to the surface these new discussions. Individuals sort of wanting to change their own rights and what they have access to as well. So the voices of these individuals can really come to the forefront, I think. And I think, the media can really play a role in that as well. And, like what we're doing here today and discussing the role of women in these contexts, and, giving them a voice and a space and creating a narrative for their own experiences. I think, during conflict, women are often forced to flee, and so they often are exposed to new ideas and new concepts, new people, and how they can sort of feed that back into their own society, into their own families, I think as well is really important. I'm not sure if it's the same necessarily in Ukraine, but I know in Syria that, the family unit is a really important part of the community. So I think, if we are seeing more women in leadership roles or in decision-making roles, I think is the key point there as well. This sort of can, role model that behaviour as well. Conflict just adds many additional layers to an already patriarchal system that we all live in. So how women combat that and overcome that is incredible. I think we can learn a lot from their resilience and their coping mechanisms. The daily challenges of war, which is, a very masculine society as well. And I think as well, we have to remember as well that during this time of conflict, women's identities are changing. So, their own ideas are just changing every day, and their their dreams and their future is really challenged. And there is a lot of research out there in Syria that really does look at that as well, and has talked to women about these experiences as well. So yeah, I think there's a lot that we can learn from that. But I think it's often repressed in a conflict as well, because there's so many other things to think of. Essential services, of course, are at the forefront of particularly humanitarian aid. But as these conflicts, particularly nowadays, are becoming quite prolonged and protracted, then we really need to think about how we turn some of those lessons into development as well.
Right. Yeah, thank you. That was very enlightening. That makes complete sense. Sort of the unfortunate need to flee or be displaced also creates an opportunity to encounter new experiences and ideas that perhaps wouldn't have come otherwise. Now we would like to ask to know a bit more about the Council of Europe. Just in case someone doesn't know, or even if they do, it's always good to sort of revise concepts and the role of institutions. So we would like to ask you, Murvi, about the Council of Europe, which is the continent's, so Europe's leading human rights organization. It includes 46 member states. At least I don't know if Russia has been suspended or how that plays out in the member state count. But could you talk to us more about the Council of Europe in general, and then about the work of the Council of Europe office in Ukraine, where you work specifically, and what its role is in Ukraine now, before the war, and what will it be after the war, which we hope comes very, very soon.
Thanks. Yes, the number of member states is 46. So, and this does not include Russia. So it was 47 just some weeks ago, but is now 46. The Council of Europe, we work for human rights, democracy, and rule of law. And I'd like to make distinctions. I know that many know, but I have also encountered that people get confused with the European institutions, and because of the flag has stars and it's blue and so on, and people get kind of what is what. So the Council of Europe is not the same as European Union. There's also the Council of the European Union, which is different, which is not us. All of the European Union member states are members in the Council of Europe, but not all Council of Europe members are in the EU. So we have also members in the Caucasus, and for example, Ukraine is a member of the Council of Europe. And maybe one of the most well-known institutions of the Council of Europe is the European Court of Human Rights. As the founding document really of the Council of Europe is the European Convention on Human Rights. So this is kind of the basis of everything. And then there has been a number of conventions on different themes, really on the wide variety of themes that create kind of this European standards in regards to human rights and democracy and rule of law. As I mentioned, Russia was excluded after the escalation of the war in Ukraine. And the other country that is not member in Europe is Belarus. So these are the countries that can't really assign to these the values of the Council of Europe. The Council of Europe does a kind of a wide variety of things. There are the standards and other intergovernmental work, but then we also do what we call cooperation work, which is kind of a development work, where we support the member states and when they are kind of developing the legal frameworks and their capacities and their systems of rule of law and human rights and democracy. And this is really based on what we call a triangle, a strategic triangle. So there are the standards, for example, the European Convention of Human Rights, or the Istanbul Convention, which is about combating and preventing violence against women. And then there are monitoring systems that then monitor the standards, and then the cooperation work tries to fill in the gap where we can see that the member states need some assistance to fulfill the standards. So that's how we work. And the Council of Europe office in Ukraine is the biggest Council of Europe field office. Last year we had 19 projects, which is quite a big number for the Council of Europe field office. And my job is then to support the projects working there, so that they take the gender perspective into account, and I also support other Eastern Partnership countries. Important thing is to remember that the Council of Europe is not a humanitarian organization or conflict prevention or peace building or anything like this. But I do think that if we think about conflicts and war and these situations, our values and this ideas of human rights and democracy and rule of law really are like the basic building blocks of stable societies and peaceful societies. So in this, they are very important. And of course, gender equality in this is very important. I mean, you can't have a sustainable democracy if you don't have a gender equality or sustainable or like full human rights if gender equality is not met. Before the war, our office in Kiev, our office is in Kiev, but we do work like in the entire Ukraine. We really did basically all of the things the Council of Europe does. So as I mentioned, it's the biggest office, and we had quite many projects. So we work in all of the focus areas. And this includes, for example, supporting the justice system. So we, for example, support the Prosecutor General in Ukraine. We developed the legal aid system. We also, in regards to human rights and ill treatment, we have worked with the State Bureau of Investigations and the Ombudsperson's Office and so on. So this is like kind of the human rights and justice things that we work with. Then there's the democracy. We support the Central Election Committee and otherwise also like political participation, including women's participation or, for example, implementation of gender quotas in Ukraine. Also civil society participation, youth participation, we have projects on these. We also have a project on IDP, so internally displaced people's rights. So it's important to remember that the war in Ukraine didn't start on 24th of February. It started in 2014. So they already had quite a lot of internally displaced people. So we work in regards to their rights, also minority rights, especially the Roma rights, and then local government and local democracy. We support them, and decentralization. What else? Corruption, money laundering, and then one of the gender-specific project is on combating violence against women and advancing the ratification of the Istanbul Convention. So these are maybe the main areas. Now, during the war, of course, the Council of Europe as an organization, we support Ukraine and in different aspects and different kind of entities of the Council of Europe have supported, but the office work has been suspended for a while in the beginning of the escalation of the war, especially was disrupted. But the government in Ukraine is working, and we are reprogramming now. And the Secretary General of the Council of Europe just said that we adjust our plans for Ukraine, and we are now in the process of doing this. There have been some activities. For example, one of our projects is supporting the Prosecutor General by an advisory group, kind of expert advice on the investigations of gross human rights violations. So this is for the investigations of the war crimes happening there. And we have had, for example, the youth project is working with the youth centers and youth workers and supporting them and during the conflict times. Our media project has also done some work on protection of journalists and freedom of media issues. After the war, we'll see what happens, because the Council of Europe works really very closely with the Ukrainian government. I mean, of course, we work with civil society and other organizations, but we agree, our projects with the government. So what we do based on their needs and their priorities, and of course we have to see ourselves what we can do, because we have a very kind of a certain kind of mandate, limited but very effective mandate. I do think that these issues are extremely important. So I think that, but we will most probably continue with the same issues that we have been working thus far. But if there are any questions, any specific projects, because I could go on and on quite a long time. But this is, like the basic issues in regards what the Council of Europe does. And as I said, I think that in regards to kind of a resilience and sustainable peace and stable societies, the work that Council of Europe is really important.
I wanted to ask if there were any programs that are happening now for maybe people who are Ukraine or refugees in the area. Is there anything specific for them?
Well, I have to say that the Council of Europe is not specifically working, for example, outside of Ukraine, in this sense that we would have started projects. So not from us. I mean, others are doing lots of things. I mean, I know a little bit about what others are doing, but there are certain things that we are doing also now. For example, I think it was just yesterday or maybe or this week, we have an intergovernmental body on that works on anti-trafficking. So they have, for example, released these guidelines and kind of instructions on how to combat human trafficking, because this is a big issue. And of course, at the political level, the Council of Europe is supporting in many ways. The Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe is supporting, and also, for example, those working with the local democracy and local governance. So there are many kind of a cross-fertilizations ongoing, and for example, the youth project has done these meetings with people from other contexts who have experience from conflict. But the Council of Europe itself is not working just outside of the borders or doing any specific project in this sense. Others, I think a lot, there is quite a lot of ongoing in this regard.
Okay, so the war in Ukraine has severely impacted the security and resilience of local communities, especially women and girls. So the lack of access to social services increased the care burden of local women, who end up being responsible for caring for the children, disabled, and elderly family members. Furthermore, estimates shared by the UN Women indicate that 54% of people in need of assistance from the ongoing crisis are women, and the vast majority of refugees are women and children. So obviously women must be represented in all decision-making, conflict prevention, mitigation, and other processes in pursuit of peace and security for Ukraine and beyond. Through Through your perspectives, it's democracy and rule of law, could you tell us how gender mainstreaming and gender equality are integrated in this work? And how can this meaningful representation be guaranteed?
Yeah, I think that there are several ways that this can be really approached, and if I think about from the perspective of the Council of Europe, one thing that comes to my mind is the Council of Europe Gender Equality Strategy, which is something that guides my work and guides our work internally, but it is also support for the member states. And also in regards to their work when they think about the work on human rights and democracy and rule of law and the gender perspective in that. So I think that can kind of offer some guidelines on how to think about like increasing or securing, for example, representation. And this strategy has 6 objectives. The first one is about combating and preventing sexism and gender stereotypes, which this we already discussed earlier, and in regards to power structures and like stereotypical things that men and women do during the conflict and then in other settings. I think that this is really important. Council of Europe has a recommendation on this, and it is more for the peacetime, so it doesn't really talk in this sense the conflict setting. But as a concept, I do think that it offers really important and good tools. And especially if we think about kind of a meaningful representation, I think it's important, because so that you can really participate fully. Like there needs to be, like there can't be stereotypical views of men and women, or there can't be sexism and so on. So I think that combating sexism and gender stereotypes is really, really important. And in Ukraine, I think that there has been a really good development in recent years. I mean, of course, there is a lot to do in this regard, but there has been developments, and especially since 2013-14, after the Euromaidan, or the Revolution of Dignity, there has been, and women have been in different roles, and nowadays women are even like this combating roles, which is a big change there. I mean, of course, there are a very, very small group, but still, I think that this is one issue. Of course, our second objective in the strategy is combating and preventing violence against women and domestic violence. And of course, this is, like, in this context, extremely important, and being able to really work and participate without the fear of violence. We have also this goal of ensuring access to justice, and this can be different forms, especially in the conflict settings in regards to gender-based violence, especially like conflict-related sexual violence and these type of things, that you actually have access to justice, but also as judges and prosecutors and working in the justice system, so access in 2 different ways. In the strategy, there's also a goal of ensuring balanced participation. So the Council of Europe has this kind of that there should be at least 40% of underrepresented sex. So I think that this is, of course, kind of something that increases women's and girls' perspectives, because I do think that it's not just about counting heads, but also about the meaningful and actually providing the perspectives and being, so that we know the needs of women and girls. There's also an objective on protecting the rights of migrant, refugee, and asylum-seeking women and girls, which in this context I think is a really important point. There is a huge number of internally displaced people, huge number of refugees. So I do think that the vulnerabilities related to in these situations is an important perspective, and listening and taking their perspective into account, really kind of guaranteeing a meaningful representation, as you mentioned. I think that this is This is important. And then we have a general goal of gender mainstreaming all of the activities, which is, I think, something that we talk about a lot, but how it is actually done in regards to, for example, humanitarian work or how international organizations actually do gender mainstream and take the gender perspective into account is something that I think still needs to be addressed. As Kirsten mentioned, sometimes other things take over and other things are seen more important. But for effectiveness, I do think that this is very important. So I think that these are some of the aspects if we think about how gender equality is in these contexts integrated into the work that is done for human rights and for democracy and rule of law.
Right. Thank you. That was a very comprehensive overview. As someone with a legal background, I kind of got stuck with the rule of law, and I imagine that the access to justice for women affected by gender-based violence and violence coming from the conflict, I imagine that one is it's very, very important. I imagine it's very challenging when you don't have strong rule of law system, or the rule of law has been disrupted by the conflict itself. Not to speak of but this in general, in the whole world, the lack of perhaps gender training or gender awareness of everyone in the process, the judges, the lawyers, that's in a patriarchal society that we live in, unfortunately, that is always a very big problem. I imagine it's aggravated when the rule of law itself is under threat. That's
I do. Yes, it is an issue, and I think that in regards to, for example, conflict-related sexual violence, the problem really is a kind of a multi-layered, because there's, first of all, just access to services, whether you can get the services at the very first level. Then there's that whether you report it, and what I have been hearing now really is that women, and also now the reports are that men and boys even less want to report it, because there's also now reports that also men and boys are being raped. So I think that then whether you want to report it, and then if you report it, how does the justice system treat these cases? What is the sensitivity? What is that? Do they actually have finally access to justice in this sense? It is a very challenging issue, and something that I think Ukraine will have to work on and for a quite long time, because of course these are then processes that also go along for a long time. So it is a very, very challenging, and the numbers are huge, of course, now, and we don't even know what is happening in the occupied areas. So it is. But there is also work being done quite a lot in this, and I believe that this is also something that, especially post-conflict situations, the Council of Europe would be very, very actively working in strengthening the justice system and the rule of law and the structures that are there.
I'm sure that's really, really important. There can be no stable democracy or peace without a rule of law, strong rule of law, I think, a healthy one at least. Another point that we would like to touch upon and talk to you both, it has already been shortly mentioned, it's about media and coverage, because one thing that makes conflicts happening nowadays around the world different from conflicts happening, say, 100 years ago, and all of the ones that came before, is that now we can see news, not only from the major news outlets like CNN or BBC. I know BBC has Ukrainecast, which is a podcast that gives daily updates of what's happening, and sometimes mostly on the ground, and they have live coverage. And I know in other parts of the world, Al Jazeera does this work as well, really well. And then we have social media platforms with a democratization, if we can say that, content, of sharing content. A lot of people share their experiences on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok. There's a lot of information being shared that way, and a lot, unfortunately, spreading of disinformation and misinformation as well. And I guess one question we would like to pose to you, reflection, is as news coverage continues to happen and updates and stories continue to be shared in form of writing, pictures, and very often videos as well, from the wars happening around the world. What are some factors or important information that, in your perspective, maybe go overlooked throughout all of this media sharing? And perhaps how can we make sure that the stories of women's experiences are being seen and properly seen? Maybe Kirsten, if you want to share with us your reflections on this.
Yeah, sure. That's a great question. I think, yeah, it is hard when we see a lot of the images on the screen. And I know a lot of us, or a lot of people can get, a lot of fatigue from that. I know it's difficult when you're sort of working in those contexts and then seeing it on the TV. But I think that there is certainly a role for the media to play in supporting those narratives of women that are contributing and are part of the conflict. And often on those front lines as well. And I know there's been some incredible footage come out of a woman in Ukraine who was facing the Russian soldiers, and telling them to leave, and that was incredibly powerful. And we are starting to see more of that. We're starting to see, women in northern India protesting as well against conflicts in those settings. So that is actually making it to the screen, which is fantastic. Because I think, a lot of us do just sort of see war as, men and weapons. So I think it is a lot deeper than that, and challenging that system as well, that what is happening in the conflict. So I think, it's still got a long way to go. I think we still need to have much more balance of stories and what is being represented. I think, we have to be very aware that a lot of it is perhaps not true. And that does happen, particularly with it being so rapid, that information that we're receiving. But I think, I think if we sort of can capitalize on some of those more powerful stories and making sure that the voices of women in those situations are being reflected.
Yeah, I could. I try to start to think that what is being neglected or what is being overlooked in the Ukrainian context, and I think that, of course, because it's in Europe at least, it's such a huge news and it's everywhere, and it's like in this kind of a traditional media, but then in social media, and you can there's so much to read and look at and listen to and all this. So I was trying to think that whether there would be something that is being overlooked. I think that one of the issues is this kind of overload. So the proportionality and kind of having a perspective and knowing what is important and what is not important gets quite difficult. And of course, in Ukraine, the Ukrainian government and Ukrainian people have been quite good at getting their message out, which I think is good. It's a way of, and of course, like Zelensky has become this kind of a figurehead and icon for this. But I do think that in the Ukrainian context, also some of the women's stories are coming out, but I'm not sure that whether that is enough and whether it's really giving the whole perspective or whole variety of things. And for example, because there are women in combat roles and women in the territorial defense and so on. So having these not so traditional roles coming out in the media. But I do know that this has also, it is being done. And I heard a speech by a Ukrainian researcher who had done a kind of a comparison from Euromaidan media coverage of gender roles and women's role in that and in this. And there has been a change that women are not just the ones being protected, or the ones who are kind of the inspiration for men when they are fighting, but also more active. So I think that these kind of active roles, it is important that these are being brought up. And there are some public figures in Ukraine who are women, like the prosecutor general, for example. Her role as also investigating the war crimes and so on is quite visible. And one thing maybe to mention is, of course, from the perspective of intersectionality, is how we are seeing minorities represented, and how they're all, because of course they face again different kind of challenges, and what is their perspective and their experience and their needs. That is maybe something that has not come up so much, because, for example, from the perspective of Roma minority in Ukraine. So I think that maybe those are some of the things that is not seen today, but I think that in general it is about being overloaded. There's too much, or you can't really get a perspective on kind of a comprehensive picture, because there's so much ongoing.
I just wanted to add one thing. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Just regarding sort of the health system's role in that as well. And I think, a lot of what we've been seeing in Ukraine and Syria is unfortunately incredibly similar in the targeting of hospitals and the weaponization of health. And I don't think it was really on the media so much during the Syrian conflict, but it's very much been at the forefront of the media for during the recent conflict in Ukraine, and within that we often also see sort of, again, women as sort of the victims in these settings as well, which of course they very much are in certain situations when it's affecting maternity hospitals, for example. And I think the media is certainly really latching onto that a bit as well. And again, perhaps there's maybe some space in there for some of that narrative to be sort of explored a bit more, and again talking about the people that are involved in the leadership in those places as well. So perhaps there's something missing from there. Again, having health and women as both victims, whereas actually maybe there's a space for them to both be contributing to peace building, for example.
Yes, of course. But I don't know. Of course, there's always a long way to go with anything. Until we achieve gender equality, nothing's going to be perfect relating to the representation of women. But I find it quite encouraging that, as Murvi was mentioning, seeing women with this, maybe burdening, but with this amount of content representing women and made by women, seeing women in a conflict setting not only as a victim or as a symbol in relation to men, like a mother, wife, or something like that, but seeing them as agents in their own lives and in society is very valuable. And it's something we definitely wouldn't have gotten these stories told at all because there was no interest to do so. And even more aggravated when it comes to minorities or people who are even more marginalized in other ways as well. So at least I find it quite encouraging that these stories are being told and were told, and they will stay in history for, perhaps for hoping that armed conflicts would end. Being realistic, they probably won't, but starting to build different narratives around women in these settings.
Yeah, and if I could add, I think that there's also, I don't know how much, but I have at least seen, for example, LGBTI soldiers or combatants and things like this, which kind of widens the stereotypical views of certain roles. So as you said, it is encouraging that it doesn't mean that there is a full equality and all is good, but at least there is a little bit of loosening these kind of stereotypical roles, and different kind of representations are coming up. So yeah, I think it's that there is hope in this sense. Yeah.
So we are sadly reaching the end of our episode. So we just want to ask you, what are maybe a key takeaway, or maybe two key takeaways that you would like people to take from this talk? Kirsten, maybe you could go first.
No, only two. Okay. I think a couple of the key things to mention, this is sort of from my own research and what we've been discussing today, is that I think, sort of ultimately framing women as vital contributors and decision makers in conflict settings, in all systems as well, not just health, is really essential for taking those baby steps that we need to be taking towards gender equality and gender equity. And another thing, I guess, as well, is that which has been coming out strongly throughout this as well, is that we need to continue discussing these narratives in all of their different contexts, and learning from one another, and sharing lessons where things have maybe not gone right, or things that might go well in another setting as well. So I think communication on that level is really important.
Yeah, I guess it's my turn. Well, I think that one thing is that the gender equality has a value in itself, of course, but as I said, and from my perspective, and from the perspective of Council of Europe, it really is like an essential building block for democracy and human rights and rule of law, and this way also to stable and peaceful societies. Because if we look at the countries that are the safest and the most stable and least corrupt and so on, that they are also the countries that rank high in when it comes to gender equality. So I do think that these are very much connected, and kind of feed each other in this way. Another thing is that I think that it is important to ensure representation, but also that the different voices are heard. I think the meaningful representation is important, but also kind of a strengthening agency and empowering women and girls are important. And this is something that is important, that when women and girls or women's organizations are speaking, are we listening, and are we hearing what they are saying, and are we then making decisions, or are they informing the systems? So I think that this is something that is quite important, that in to kind of make sure, for example, going forward, that the peace that you're building is for all people, and everyone's rights are respected.
Right. Thank you both. So we have sadly reached the end of this Spring Talks episode about gender and armed conflict.
We want to thank our guests, Murvi and Kirsten, for their wonderful insights and for sharing their time with us.
Yes, we want to extend that thanks to our audience. Thank you for being interested and listening to important topics. And we will see you in the next Spring Talks episode. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Stay tuned for next week, where we will discuss sexual harassment in the workplace. Thank you for listening to Pink Talks. Before we go, show some love for our favorite podcast by leaving us a comment and subscribe to the channel. We are Young Educators, a non-profit organization working on human rights, gender equality, and active citizenship. And this podcast was created with the support of our team: Ana Catarina Caldeira, Laura Staffi, Margarida Martins, and Lia Cheney.